In 1971, two men from Philadelphia walked into a meeting at CBS Records with one idea. They had studied the Motown blueprint. They understood exactly how Berry Gordy had built his empire, and they believed they could build something better. By 1975, just 4 years later, their label had eclipsed Motown on the charts, the sound of Philadelphia. 170 gold and platinum records. A house band whose music became the theme of the most important black music television show in history. And a roster of artists that changed what soul music was allowed to say about the world. Kenny Gamble, Leon Huff, Philadelphia International Records. This is not just the story of a record label. This is the story of two black men who looked at the most powerful music machine in America, took notes, went home, and built something that made the whole industry rethink who was in charge. Stay with us, because by the time this video is over, you will understand why producers today still call what Gamble and Huff did the blueprint. The origin, how it started song clip, Expressway to Your Heart, The Soul Survivors, Gamble Huff production, 1967. Before there was Philadelphia International Records, there were two young men who had already failed twice. Trying to build their own label. Kenny Gamble was a songwriter from South Philadelphia who had been recording himself on arcade machines as a kid. Leon Huff was a classically trained session pianist from Camden, New Jersey, a man who had played sessions for Phil Spector, the Ronettes, and Carole King in New York. Before finding his way back to Philadelphia. They met in the mid-1960s as session musicians, and from the very beginning they were obsessed with one question. Not just how to make great music, but how to own it. Here is the fact that defines everything that follows. Before they launched Philadelphia International, Gamble and Huff made a pilgrimage to Detroit. They visited Motown Records specifically to study the setup, how the rooms were arranged, how the songwriting and production pipeline worked, how Berry Gordy had built a machine that turned raw talent into international stars. Gamble himself said it directly years later. Motown was the inspiration. Motown showed him that black people could own the songs, could own the business, not just sing on stage and collect whatever was left over. They took everything they learned at Hitsville back to Philadelphia, and then they built something different. Two previous label attempts had folded XL Records. Then Neptune Records, when Chess Records changed ownership. But in 1971, with a distribution deal from CBS Records and a $75,000 advance for 15 singles, Philadelphia International Records opened its doors on South Broad Street. The machine was running. But before we go any further, if nobody ever told you about this channel, think about how close you came to never finding this. Don't let that happen to somebody else, and don't let it happen to you again. Hit subscribe right now, turn on notifications, because where we're going next in this story, you cannot afford to tap out. All right, now back to it. The sound. What made it different song clip. Backstabbers. The OJs. Philadelphia International. 1972. The Motown Sound was built on tambourines, rhythm section precision, and the gospel-inflected pop of Detroit's assembly line. It was designed to cross over, to reach white America without alienating it. Gamble and Huff had a different vision entirely. The Philadelphia Sound was orchestral, 30-piece string sections from the world-renowned Philadelphia Orchestra. Lush arrangements that wrapped soul vocals in something that felt closer to classical music than to anything on the radio before it. Punching brass, a sliding, insistent hi-hat rhythm that would eventually become the DNA of disco. And underneath all of it, a message. Gamble and Huff were not interested in making music that avoided the world's problems. Backstabbers was social commentary. Wake Up Everybody was a call to action. For the love of money, the bass line alone still plays in arenas worldwide today, was a meditation on greed and survival. Where Motown had polished its artists into crossover-ready silk, Philadelphia International was putting politics into the pocket of the groove. The music was luxurious and urgent at the same time. Grammy-winning producer Jimmy Jam, who built his entire career studying what Gamble and Huff did, said it directly. He told the New York Times that Philadelphia International offered him the blueprint, that the green CBS label at the bottom of every PIR record, proof that a black-owned company was operating at the same level as the major labels, was something that changed how he understood what was possible. You saw that green label. You knew it was going to be great. The house band, MFSB song clip, To Sop, The Sound of Philadelphia. MFSB, featuring the 3 Degrees, Philadelphia International, 1974. Here is the detail that separates Philadelphia International from almost every other label in history. Gamble and Huff had a house band, more than 30 studio musicians based at Sigma Sound Studios on South Broad Street, guitarists, bassists, drummers, a full string section, a brass section, vibraphonist, percussionists. All of them working together, black musicians and white musicians in the same room, building the same sound. They called themselves MFSB, mother, father, sister, brother. That name was intentional. Gamble and Huff wanted to communicate something about the philosophy. Behind what they were building. This was a family. This was a community. Not an assembly line. Not anonymous hired hands collecting $5 a session and going home. Now compare that directly to what was happening in Detroit. The Funk Brothers, the Motown house band, played on every major Motown hit of the 1960s. James Jamerson, Benny Benjamin, Earl Van Dyke, musicians whose names did not appear on a single Motown release for decades, who were underpaid and kept deliberately invisible so the world would not understand how much of the Motown sound belonged to them and not to Berry Gordy. Gamble and Huff did something different. By 1972, MFSB was recording as a named act under their own name on Philadelphia International. They had their own albums, their own singles, their own identity. And in the spring of 1974, Don Cornelius, the creator of Soul Train, came to Gamble asking for a theme song for his newly nationally syndicated show. Gamble convened MFSB at Sigma Sound with arranger Bobby Martin and backing vocal group The 3 Degrees. What came out of that session was To Sop, The Sound of Philadelphia. It went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, #1 on the R&B chart, #1 on the Adult Contemporary chart, a Grammy for Best R&B Instrumental Performance. It was the first television theme song in history to reach the top of the pop charts, and the men and women who played on it had their names on the record. The world knew who they were. That is not a small difference. That is a philosophical difference about who deserves credit for what gets built. The OJs, the Moral Voice song clip, Love Train. The OJs, Philadelphia International, 1973. The OJs had been recording for over 10 years before they signed with Philadelphia International. 10 years, multiple labels, multiple name changes, a solid regional following, but never the national breakthrough that their voices deserved. By the time they arrived at Sigma Sound Studios in 1972, Walter Williams, Eddie Levert, and William Powell were seasoned professionals who had been waiting for someone to give them the right material. Gamble and Huff gave them backstabbers, social commentary wrapped in a groove so infectious it seemed impossible to resist. It went to #3 on the pop chart, #1 R&B, The OJs were finally on the map. Then came Love Train in 1973, a call for global unity. People all over the world join hands that went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was joyful. It was political. It was Gamble and Huff using pop music as a vehicle for the message they had been trying to send since the beginning. The OJ's relationship with Philadelphia International would span decades. For the Love of Money, I Love Music, Used to Me My Girl, 25 years of collaboration. What Kenny Gamble said in an interview captures something essential about how that relationship worked. He and Huff were like teachers, and the OJs were students who gave everything they had back to the music. That was a different covenant than most artists ever experienced at a major label. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the Discovery song clip, If You Don't Know Me By Now, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, Philadelphia International, 1972.
You should understand me.
The story of how Teddy Pendergrass became the voice of Philadelphia International is one of the most unlikely origin stories in the history of soul music. Harold Melvin had been leading the Blue Notes since the 1950s. Doo-wop, soul, multiple lineup changes across multiple decades.
You don't know me by now.
When his group started touring with a New York R&B act called the Cadillacs in the late 1960s, he noticed their young drummer, a 20-year-old from North Philadelphia named Theodore Pendergrass. He hired him as the Blue Notes drummer. He was a drummer. During one performance, Pendergrass started singing along. Harold Melvin heard what was coming out of that man's mouth and promoted him to lead singer on the spot. Gamble and Huff had originally tried to sign Marvin Jr. of the Dells, a singer whose raspy baritone they loved. The Dells wouldn't leave Chess Records. When the Blue Notes walked in with Pendergrass, Gamble heard that voice.
If you don't know me by now, just ain't no...
And understood immediately. He was close enough. He was more than close enough. If You Don't Know Me By Now was the second single. It went to #1 on the soul chart. Top 10 pop. Pendergrass was 22 years old. The Love I Lost. Wake Up Everybody. Bad Luck. Don't Leave Me This Way.
If you don't know me by now.
A record that Thelma Houston would later cover for Motown and turn into a disco hit. By 1975, the tension inside the group had become unavoidable. Pendergrass was the reason people came, but Harold Melvin controlled the money. Pendergrass wanted the group renamed. Melvin refused. In 1976, Pendergrass walked. Philadelphia International did not let him go. They signed him as a solo artist. 4 consecutive million-selling albums between 1977 and 1981. He became the defining male sex symbol of late 70s R&B. Then in March 1982, his car was involved in an accident that left him paralyzed from the chest down. He was 31 years old. He kept recording. He performed at Live Aid in 1985 from his wheelchair. He made a Grammy-nominated comeback in 1988. He died in 2010 at the age of 59. The voice that Harold Melvin discovered behind a drum kit became one of the most important voices in the entire history of soul music. That is what happens when a label is paying close enough attention to actually see what is standing right in front of them. Billy Paul, the record that almost didn't happen song clip. Me and Mrs. Jones. Billy Paul, Philadelphia International, 1972. Me and Mrs. Jones.
Holding hands
Is one of the most nakedly emotional records in the history of R&B. It is a song about an affair, not coded, not metaphorical. A man and a woman who meet every day at the same cafe, knowing that what they are doing is wrong. Unable to stop, Billy Paul's vocal world weary, tender,
it hurts so much inside.
absolutely committed to the feeling, landed in December 1972 and went to #1 on both the pop and R&B charts. It won the Grammy Award for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. Here is what most people do not know. Gamble and Huff had originally written Me and Mrs. Jones with Patti LaBelle's group, LaBelle, in mind. LaBelle could not record it in time. Billy Paul, who had been on the Philadelphia music circuit for years, a jazz-trained singer who had already cut records that went nowhere, was handed the song. He recorded it in one session. One session. The production was immaculate. Bobby Martin's string arrangement building from almost nothing to something that feels genuinely heartbroken. Huff's piano, MFSB holding the whole thing together underneath Paul's voice, like a hand extended towards something irretrievable. That record has never left the cultural conversation. It plays on radio today. It has been sampled, covered, referenced in films, television, literature. A song about infidelity that somehow became a song about the unbearable weight of wanting something you cannot have. Now she'll go her way. Billy Paul never had another record that approached it commercially, but he did not need to. One perfect record, recorded in a single session, inside a building on South Broad Street in Philadelphia, in 1972, that is enough for a legacy. Mrs. Jones. The Spinners. What Motown Threw Away song clip. I'll Be Around. The Spinners. Atlantic Records, 1972. The Spinners are on this list because what happened to them is one of the clearest examples of what Philadelphia International represented in contrast to what came before. These men spent 9 years at Motown. 9 years of near invisibility. Motown had them working as road managers, chaperones, shipping clerks, anything other than the recording artists they actually were. The label had more talent than it could properly develop, and the Spinners were consistently at the back of the line. The one hit they managed, It's a Shame, written and produced by Stevie Wonder in 1970, proved they had something. And then Motown still couldn't properly follow it up. When their contract expired in 1972, Aretha Franklin personally told them to go to Atlantic Records. They did. Atlantic connected them with a Philadelphia-based producer named Tom Bell, one of the architects of the Philly Sound. A man who had been in the room with Gamble and Huff since the very beginning. Bell heard what was inside those voices and built a cathedral around them. I'll Be Around. Could It Be I'm Falling in Love? Mighty Love. Then Came You, a #1 pop hit with Dionne Warwick. 27 top 100 singles in the decade that followed. 27, after 9 years of nothing at Motown. The Spinners' story is not technically a Philadelphia International story, but it is a Philly Sound story. Because the aesthetic philosophy, the lush arrangements, the careful attention to what a specific singer could do, with the right production, that was Tom Bell's gift. And Tom Bell's gift came out of the same ecosystem that Gamble and Huff built on South Broad Street. What Motown threw away, Philadelphia caught and turned into gold. The Jacksons. What happened when Motown's biggest family arrived at South Broad Street? Song clip. Enjoy Yourself. The Jacksons. Epic Philadelphia International, 1976. In 1975, the Jackson 5 left Motown, lost their name, and became the Jacksons. They signed with Epic Records. And for their first 2 albums as a new act on a new label, Epic hired Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff to produce them. Think about what that means. The family that Berry Gordy had built into the most commercially successful act of the early 70s. The group whose departure from Motown was one of the most public breaks in the label's history, and the first producers those brothers worked with after leaving was the team that had built the label that was beating Motown on the charts. Leon Huff said working with Michael and his brothers was one of the highlights of his career. You can hear why on Enjoy Yourself, the platinum-selling first single. Michael Jackson at 17, his voice balanced perfectly between the child he had been at Motown and the artist he was becoming. The production warm and confident, the Philly machine doing what it did best, taking talent that already existed and making it sound like it had finally arrived home. That collaboration lasted 2 albums. After that, Michael Jackson found Quincy Jones. The rest is history.
Let's have a good time, you and me. Sitting there with your mouth pulled out.
But for one brief, specific moment in 1976, the kid who had watched Berry Gordy keep his family's masters, who was already studying the architecture of the music business, was making records in Philadelphia, with the men who had built an alternative to everything Motown represented. The lesson did not go unlearned. Why it mattered. The legacy song clip, Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now. McFadden and Whitehead, Philadelphia International, 1979. Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now came out in 1979. Gene McFadden and John Whitehead, 2 staff writers and producers at Philadelphia International, who had been working in the building for years, finally released it under their own names. It went to #1 R&B, top 10 pop. It became an anthem. The title was not accidental.
I know you know someone that has a negative vibe.
This was a label full of people who understood something that the industry did not want them to understand: that black people could build the infrastructure, could own the publishing, could run the rooms where decisions were made. By 1975, Philadelphia International and the Philly soul sound it had created had eclipsed Motown in pop and R&B chart dominance. That is not an opinion. That is what the charts showed. The machine in Philadelphia, the one that Gamble and Huff had built by studying the machine in Detroit and improving on it, had become the new center of black popular music in America.
Nowhere to go. Ask them where they're going.
170 gold and platinum records, 25 top 10 R&B hits written by Gamble and Huff alone, a house band that had its own career, its own Grammy, its own name on its own records, artists who were treated as long-term investments rather than short-term catalog assets. And a distribution deal with CBS that put the PIR Green label on the same shelf as every major label in the country. Kenny Gamble said Motown was the inspiration, but what he and Huff built was the correction, the thing Motown could have been if the artists had been given more of what they built. The archive runs deep, and on South Broad Street in Philadelphia, for one extraordinary decade, it ran all the way to the top.
We're moving.